Unshaken Allegiance. What's it all about? It's a book I've written which draws together 15 years or more, 20 years even, of thinking about religious freedom. We've been active in this space for a very long time. We have been opposing negative changes. We have been trying to work constructively with governments in building compromises which will work for everybody in a multi-faith and multicultural society. But some of those battles we have lost, and this is not just true of Australia, it's true of the UK, it's true of Canada, it's true of other countries as well. We're experiencing now a much more difficult legal environment in terms of religious freedom. So how do we navigate that? How do we live wisely in that situation? Michael was only half joking, I think, about the prison cell. I hope it never comes to that. But if we're going to face these sorts of consequences, they must be about the right things. They must be about situations where we have to take a stand. And one of the worst things we can do is to be reckless and to die on the wrong hill. And so that's what this book is all about. It's my wisdom, such as it is as a lawyer and having been involved in this space for so long, about why it is that we're experiencing these pressures, what's happening, that the environment is so changed, and how do we navigate that sensibly? What does it mean to trust God in situations when we may be under significant threat? And what I want to share with you today is from one of the chapters where I talk about living peaceably. What does it mean to live peaceably? How do we do that? When do we do that? When do we resolve things rather than trying to fight? There will be situations where we need to defend our position vigorously, to insist on our legal rights, to do all the things that Freedom for Faith has done in campaigning. All of those things are true. But there'll be other situations where being wise as serpents, as innocent as doves, as Jesus put it, is the right way to go. And some of this pressure that we are experiencing drives us back to the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus taught about these things. So that's where we are going. Not quite sure how we're going with the slides, but we do seem to be working. Good. So the first thing I want to say is just why is it that we're in this space? There's a whole chapters of the book, as you can imagine, on that. But very briefly, there's a number of things which are going on. The first one is that there's been a particular view of equality which has been put forward by people through the International Labour Organization, going back a long time through various law reform inquiries, which operates on the basis that everybody ought to be able to apply and conduct any job unless there's some sort of inherent requirement why they can't. If you need a female actress between ages of 20 and 30 for a play or a film, that's what you need, but that's what an inherent requirement is. But beyond that, there should be severe constraints on any barriers to employment in any position. And we are caught up with that, with those who would say, there's no reason why a Christian school should insist upon a Christian maths teacher or something of that kind. So that's one of the areas where we are experiencing it. We're also experiencing pressures from hate speech. Hate speech has a validity as a problem. We do not want to see people inciting hatred or violence. Very important for our Jewish friends, very important for others too, who can be the subject of hate crimes and incitements to violence. But so often what has happened is that hate speech has become synonymous with an idea that I hate. And it can be weaponized in all sorts of ways in order to control what people are allowed to say, what they're allowed to express. That's one of the other factors you get. You see laws weaponized in various ways by activists who will make complaints, and the punishment is the process. And it can be extraordinarily expensive to defend some of these cases. For them, it's free to bring the complaint, but it can be much harder to oppose it. We're seeing a lot of that. One of the things that I say in the book is very important is that a lot of these laws which can affect us are not aimed at us. We're caught in the crossfire of culture wars where we may be involved as well. Do you know the most dangerous belief system to hold in Australia at the moment? It's to be a gender-critical feminist. Very often they are people of the left, typically. They may well have a lesbian sexual orientation, some of them. I know many of them, and I'm friends with them, but they experience a lot of pressure because of their beliefs. But we also can be caught up in the crossfire of these sorts of things, and people have lost their jobs because they haven't been willing to endorse a social transition of a child at school or those sorts of things. And then finally, and this is a really big issue, a diminishing respect for freedom of conscience. It used to be standard through the professional community, particularly the medical community, that we could express conscientious objection to procedures like abortion that we don't feel comfortable with, euthanasia, and those have survived. But increasingly they've become restricted. You have to refer to somebody else who'll perform the operation or whatever it is. And we're not seeing freedom of conscience extended beyond its traditional sort of bounds. So those are some of the issues that we are facing. So how do we live wisely? There's 5 principles I want to share with you. They're up there on the screen. I'll take you through them. They're all in the chapter in the book on living peaceably. And look, I'm going to tell some stories where there may be differences of view within this audience, and that's fine. These are my thoughts about these issues, respecting the fact that other people may have different points of view on them. So, first of all then, let's look at what Paul had to say, urging us to pray for kings and all those in authority. Why? That we may live godly and quiet lives, that the gospel may be proclaimed. That is fundamentally our orientation. We will not regain the culture without revival. We will not see a transformation again in our civil society without revival of faith. So we can forget that, but we do want to live godly and quiet lives so that we may be able to share the gospel. And the first principle, I think, is you pick your battles carefully. And I've given you a verse here from 2 Timothy. Don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments. We can easily be caught up, can we not, in foolish and stupid arguments on Twitter and elsewhere. And sometimes that will be the right thing to do, to engage in argument. We should be engaging in dialogue and debate wherever we can, but not in an adversarial way, not in the foolish way that a lot of these Twitter spats happen. One of the examples I wanted to share with you is the issue of drag queen story hour, and I recognize that other people may have differences of view here. My view is we've got to pick our battles carefully. We've got to work out when we expend capital, expend resources, take risks, and when we don't. And the very tragic story of Wilson Gavin, a student in Queensland, is, I think, illustrative of exactly this. What is Drag Queen Story Hour? It started in San Francisco around 2015. It has traveled all over the world, certainly all over the English-speaking world, hosting events, usually in public libraries, in which little children come and a drag queen reads them a story. Now, there's no doubt about what is the motivation for this and why it has become such a big thing. The idea is to introduce to small children the notion of gender fluidity, the notion that being male or female is a changeable sorts of categories, and so on. There's no doubt at all about its purpose. But these are events that people can choose to come to or not. Mums, dads as well, can take their 4- and 5-year-old kids to to hear that story and to see the drag queen, or they don't have to. So it's not something which is being imposed in the classroom of state schools necessarily. It's something that people can volunteer to attend. I haven't been to a drag queen story hour. Has anybody? No, probably not. I would imagine that the stories that they tell are illustrative of that sort of gender fluidity, ideas about being transgender and all those sorts of things. But one of the questions in my mind on this is, how much of that is going to be understood by a 4 or 5-year-old child? Just a week or two ago, I was reading a story to my 2 4-year-old grandchildren, twins, delightful twins, and they brought home a library book from school. It was one of those very serious books that only libraries buy. Nobody else would buy it. But it was about a family in which the mother had died, and the father was raising these children on his own. Very difficult thing for them to do, and it was meant to sort of help a child to cope with that sort of grief. So I read that story twice to my 4-year-old grandchildren. It went completely over their heads as to what the story was all about. It was just another nice story that Poppy was reading to them. Fine. And it may well be that Drag Queen Story Hour has a similar effect. When I was a kid, and if this is something you experienced, that we'd go to the pantomime. It was Cinderella. It was always the ugly sisters who'd be men. Right? That was part of the sort of theme of the whole thing. We have Mrs. Doubtfire, we have Dame Edna Everett. So there's no doubt about the intentions of the Drag Queen Story, how successful it is. I don't know. And who is taking their children to these events? Probably people who are quite sympathetic to the movement anyway. And we can't reach them except through the gospel. So that's my sense of it with Drag Queen Story Hour. But what happened in Brisbane about 4 years ago was very tragic. There was a group of students from, I think all from the University of Queensland, but certainly most, led by a man called Wilson Gavin, a young man, openly gay man, himself devout Catholic as well. And he led a protest to disrupt the Drag Queen Story Hour. And it must have been a little bit frightening for the children, to be honest, to have that happen. They would have been bewildered by that. But there was an enormous pile-on afterwards on social media. He was strongly attacked all over the country. Within about 24 hours, he had committed suicide. Now, that's a tragedy, obviously, for him, a tragedy, obviously, for his family. My point is this: was it right to pick that battle? There's so many other battles we can fight. I suspect that disrupting a Drag Queen Story Hour doesn't actually do a huge amount of good. It's certainly got a lot of negative publicity for the reasons that I gave. It was disrupting what might have been a happy childhood event. Whatever we do, I think we need to be prayerfully thinking about when we engage in that sort of protest, when we pick up what battles we fight and what we don't. We will not turn the culture around by our protests. We will not turn the culture around without people coming to faith. So that's advice number one. Pick your battles carefully. The second one is this: don't provoke the bull. Don't wave a red rag in front of a bull. And the key verse here is from, or two of them: learn from me, says Jesus, for I'm gentle and humble in heart. And from Colossians, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness. And this is the disposition which we need to have. Now, the story I want to tell is one which was another very unfortunate one. It had negative consequences for the school concerned. It had significant negative consequences at the time for those of us who were engaged in trying to get a religious discrimination bill through the Parliament, because it happened at just the wrong time. It's the story of City Point School in Brisbane, as it happens again. What happened was this: City Point, a very good, I'm sure, very fine Christian school, wanted to be clear with its parents about where it stood on some of the emerging issues, one of them being, of course, children and young people who identify as trans, maybe non-binary, whatever it is. They wanted to be clear with the parents that We enroll students on the basis of their biological sex. We're not going to be changing that. And they had a very sort of statement of beliefs, which, to be clear, was a statement of the school's beliefs. They weren't asking the parents to adhere to them. They weren't saying, you need to believe these things. But there was fairly standard provisions there around sexual behavior, that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that is the only place properly for sexual conduct. And what happened was that they'd been working on a new policy, a new contract between the parents and the school, something that parents would have to sign up to and agree, yes, these are the values we know the school promotes and we're okay with that. That was the concept. And they'd been working on it for quite a while. But they released this contract in January, only a week or two before the new academic year. And it said all those things. But it also said, if you don't sign up to this, we will treat your children as withdrawn from the school. Do you see the problem? That it wasn't just saying we have revised our school contract. It was saying your children will be expelled, effectively, unless you as parents sign up to that. And there was, as you can imagine, outrage. It was on the front pages of the papers. Various people were asked to comment on it, and it was very, very hard to defend that proposition that children should have to leave the school if they wouldn't sign up, or the parents wouldn't sign up to the contract. And one of the parents said in the media at the time, look, a contract is between two parties. If you're going to renegotiate that contract, that's fine, but you have to have discussions with the people you are contracting with. And they expected there'd be information nights, there'd be discussions, there'd be an opportunity for feedback on the new contract and so on. And it was the fact that it was presented without any of that a week or so before the new academic year started, and with the consequence that if you couldn't agree to it, you would be, they said the children would be treated as withdrawn, but effectively they would be expelled. That was what was the red rag to the bull. And I'm sure the school recognizes that. I know they do, because a year or two later, after complaints to the Human Rights Commission, they apologized and there was some kind of settlement with the parents. They acknowledged they'd done the wrong thing. Indeed, they had withdrawn the new contract within days, I think 3 days or something, of its being launched. So they realized their mistake straight away, and there were people who had to resign and so on and so forth. But what are the lessons from this? It wasn't wrong for the school to say, these are our values. It wasn't wrong for them to say to the parents, part of the contract for enrolling your children in this school is that you understand this is what we believe. We're not asking you to believe. But what you do is you negotiate that with the parents, you get feedback, you give them warning, because in our current culture, a lot of the parents and a lot of the kids would not have agreed with some of those propositions. So we are gentle. We are kind, we are humble, and we say, this is what we believe, and do so gently. And specifically in that situation, apart from giving people lots of notice and not having asking them to withdraw their kids, you grandfather these schemes. What grandfathering is that you say, okay, all the kids who are currently enrolled, they're under the old contract, but for the new students, the newly enrolled students, we have a different contract. And then people are signing up, they're enrolling their kids in the school, knowing what they are agreeing to for the duration of the time that the children are in that school. And of course, if the kids had been forced to leave, not only is it a disruption to their education, it's a disruption to their friendships. Had they worked through this carefully beforehand, they could have been saved from very serious errors that occurred. So being wise, thinking about what the Sermon on the Mount would say to us, what Paul would say to us on these sorts of issues, reflecting on the fact that there may be people who disagree with us on those issues can save us from a great deal of grief. Well, there was all sorts of consequences from that. It eventually died down, but I hope you can see why it's so important to think these things through. Just hoping I can see the next slides. I might need some help from the back desk. Oh yeah, there we go. They're up on the slide. Could I get some help from somebody? Sorry. The problem is that we can see it on there, but I can't see it on here. Thank you so much. Let me, while we're doing that, just explain those things. I've already talked about them, about the need for sensitive handling. Thank you so much. Particularly on issues of sexuality and gender, where there's so much of a difference of opinion in the community, where so many kids are going through identifying as same-sex attracted or transgender. About 25% of kids these days will say that they are LGBTQI+. What do they mean by that? A whole range of things. A great number of them are non-binary girls, non-binary teenage girls. They won't be non-binary in 10 years' time. Some of these things are fads, but it is a very, very, very sensitive issue in this time. The third principle I want to share with you is about how we navigate anti-discrimination laws, which have become increasingly difficult to navigate in recent years. Particularly so in Victoria, where the religious exemptions have been all but wiped out. I'll leave it to the Victorians the detail of all of this, but essentially, yes, you can say as a Christian school you can only employ Christian staff, but it's got to be an inherent requirement. You can't break that by having a non-Christian science teacher because you have a gap. It's very difficult to navigate that law, and even if you say it's an inherent requirement, that restriction must be proportionate, which is a human rights term of it must be justified in human rights terms. So it's a very difficult situation. But there is at least some ledge for us in terms of religious freedom in Victoria. Maybe a narrow ledge, but it is at least a ledge, and we can take the maximum advantage of that. And how do we do that? Well, we do it in all sorts of ways by thinking carefully about how we recruit staff, what we're doing. You can't go out there and say, we're going to discriminate against anyone who's not a Christian believer. Well, I mean, you can if your policy is that you only employ Christian staff, and you'll get, as a lot of Christian schools do, and you say that's an inherent requirement, and you're not going to have to fill a gap with somebody who doesn't meet those criteria. So you can do it, but you've got to be aware of the test you're going to have to satisfy by so doing it. And in country areas in particular, it can be increasingly hard to fill all the jobs with people who meet the criteria of the Christian school. That's one of the challenges we have. But if you're going to say it's an inherent requirement, then your job description needs to match that. So your job description might say that everybody's expected to attend prayers before school. Everybody's expected to be able to lead a prayer, lead a Bible study. So when you say it's an inherent requirement, that's backed up by things in the job description that match that all teachers are expected to try to bring the Bible into their subject in some way or other, whatever they are teaching. All of those things will back up an inherent requirement. I did once suggest that the chaplain of a very large welfare organisation be sacked. I was talking to the board of this organisation, and they looked at me a little bit startled. The chaplain, who was there as well, was particularly startled by this suggestion. He was a good friend of mine. My point was this. I said, who leads the devotions at your board meetings, at your senior executive meetings? Oh, the chaplain does, was the answer. But that's the problem, I said. Because if it is only the chaplain who's going to lead the devotions, you haven't made it a requirement of everybody in the senior executive team to be able to do the same thing. And these are the sorts of things we need to think of in advance. But if it's merely that we have a preference for Christians teaching staff, or preference for devout Christians to hold our senior executive positions, we need to back that up as well in some way. In Christian education, we might say that one of the selection criteria is an understanding and an appreciation and willingness to engage in Christian education. You don't have to be a Christian to do that. It's not going to be easy to do so if you aren't. And by thinking very carefully about the wording, being careful about recording in your selection process why you have not shortlisted certain people and why you have shortlisted others. We're used to this when I was involved in academic work and we had a recruitment round. We would have a piece of paper from HR which asks us to explain why we have not shortlisted somebody. It didn't need to be long, but we would explain that, and when we reported back on the interview process, why did we offer the job to person X rather than person Y, Z, or whoever. That's something that you can be careful about recording in case there is any question that is raised subsequently about whether you were discriminating against people. Most people do not apply for jobs in order to make a point. Most people do not apply for jobs seeking to create a controversy. There are situations where they do. I was having coffee with the CEO of another welfare organization who told me that just that week they'd had an anti-discrimination complaint. What it was for a fairly low-level job in the organization. They insisted that senior executive be believers, but they didn't worry, of course, about the great range of staff that they employed in the wonderful work that they do. So this was an entry-level sort of job where there were no faith requirements. Before the applications had closed, this woman had lodged a discrimination complaint. You see what she's doing. Was it an activist? It could have been somebody just looking for a quick buck, thinking that the organization would have to settle. We have to fight those things. We have to stand against them. But there are other situations where we can take a different sort of approach. Sorry, we're not there yet. Yeah. Some of the biggest problems we're likely to have are where people come to different beliefs or different views on their lifestyle, different lifestyles after accepting a job in a Christian organization. That could be of many different kinds. But in that situation, I think the Sermon on the Mount helps us to say, okay, we have a situation where that person is no longer really compatible with the values of the school. They signed up to those values. They're no longer able to adhere to them. It's nobody's fault. This happens. People change. It's not the school's fault. It's not the person's fault. But there's now an incompatibility in terms of the values of each. There may not be. It may be that things can go on, that the person's beliefs are privately held and not shared with the kids. There may be no reason to turn that into a problem or a dispute. But there will be situations where the school feels, no, this person can't remain. And in the great majority of cases, that is likely to be worked out peaceably if you take the right approach. If you take an adversarial approach, if you stand on your Christian values and so on and so forth, you're likely just to create animosity and conflict. But in a situation where, as Jesus said, if somebody sues you for your shirt, you give them your cloak as well. If you are countercultural and generous in the way you respond to that situation, very likely that can be resolved. If she or he needs to find a new job, well, so be it. You might give them some money to tide them over and to bless them with saying, we're parting in peace. We don't have a conflict with you. We don't want you to have a conflict with us. We want to be able to move on. I think that's what Jesus would want us to do from his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Settle things quickly with your adversary, said Jesus. The fourth example I want to give you, the fourth bit of advice is keep calm and carry on giving Christ-like witness in these situations. And the verse that I have for you here is, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do so with gentleness and respect. You see those words coming up again, gentleness and respect. This was the situation for a school in Queensland. I tell the story in the book of Bethlehem College, classic sort of Christian school. And it experienced something like the same very strong public controversy that City Point had in Brisbane. And it happened something like the same sort of time. This was June 2022. What happened was that they amended their statement of belief on marriage. They said marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's the place for sexual behavior from a Christian point of view. Again, it was about their beliefs. It wasn't about requiring every child to believe that or every parent who enrolls the children in the school to believe that. It was simply clarifying what they themselves believed. But all hell broke loose. An activist saw this change, whipped up a campaign against this, claimed that this statement was against the law. That was nonsense. Maybe legal in New Zealand as it is here and in many other countries to marry as a same-sex couple. But that doesn't mean that Christians can't hold a different belief about those things. That's not illegal. So you get that sort of confusion quite often being put forward. But then, as this made its way into the press and there was a public controversy, another activist came forward and said, I've had hundreds of emails from people complaining about their dreadful experiences at this school. And it wasn't just on sexual orientation issues. It was everything. It was transphobia, it was racism, it was sexism. The only thing they were not accused of was child sacrifice. Those messages were never made public, so we had to take the word of this particular activist about those issues. So the school was caught in this perfect storm of people believing that they would treat children in the most dreadful ways. They had the most extreme beliefs and they were imposing them upon the children. And what was very unfortunate was around this time there was a day of action against bullying, and there was some bad student behavior of various kinds. A couple of people, students threw fruit, all pretty awful stuff, but it just happened to coincide with this public controversy. And it was alleged that people had been shouting, "Kill the gays." It was nonsense. What did the school do? It acted incredibly calmly. It said, the chair of the board said, well, apparently there's always all these complaints that we're doing all these things. We're transphobic, we're sexist, we're racist, we're this and that and the other. We're ableist, that was another one. I haven't heard those complaints, but if you have any, please contact the school. We will investigate them. So that was the first thing. Secondly, I should have maybe put this first. They got their Christian school community to pray about the situation. But they also initiated, as you can imagine, an inquiry about what happened at that day of protest against bullying. There had been bad behavior. It had not been anything to do with sexual orientation. It had not been an attack on any students for that reason. But there had been some bad behavior, and the students were disciplined for it. They got the CCTV, they interviewed all the people who were around, and so on. And there'd been an allegation that their phones had been confiscated because they were filming it. They hadn't been confiscated for that reason. They'd been confiscated because you're not allowed phones at the school during school hours. So it was all of these sorts of misinformation about things. They sought legal advice. They got a communications expert. And they simply put out, calmly and carefully, we are simply being transparent about what we believe. We care for all students. We honor all students and different beliefs. We encourage people to engage with their different views reasonably, but we don't engage in discrimination. So those sorts of messages went out. Well, a mother and a daughter, nothing to do with the school, decided they would picket the school each day. So they were out there during, the beginning of school hours. It was winter time, it would get a little bit cold at times. And the staff took hot coffee out to them every morning to help them keep warm while they were protesting, and specifically acknowledged their right to protest. You can see how this is Sermon on the Mount stuff. This is countercultural. Rather than engaging in adversarial conflict, they would love, care for, be transparent, be open, be calm. So that's my fourth consideration. The next one, The next one. Yeah, thank you for that. So it's gone from my screen again. Let me just keep talking there. The fifth point I want to make is that we can make compromises with regulators. Very often, the sorts of laws, thank you so much, that we are dealing with are ones where governments enact legislation performatively. They're under pressure, thank you so much, from... before I go on, let me just tell you the aftermath of the storm. There was an inquiry into this school. The Prime Minister had been involved, the Minister of Education had been involved. There were talks about closing the school down, this sort of thing. They instituted an inquiry. You will never survive that sort of inquiry after you've had a public controversy of that kind. Don't even think that you will. But the criticisms were, in the end, very, very mild. This was the report of the regulator. While many students, staff, and parents reported that the school provides a positive educational experience, a strong sense of community for learners, and a safe learning environment, this was not the experience of all students. A small number of current and former students reported feeling deeply hurt by the experience at the school, and I'm sorry if that was so. But you see that there's none of the racism, sexism, ableism, child sacrifice that were the sorts of allegations that they were dealing with. It was a fairly mild rebuke from the regulator, which is what I would have expected to be the least that would happen in that situation. Okay, moving on. Negotiate appropriate compromise. Settle matters quickly, says Jesus, with your adversary along the way. And very often we can reach agreements with regulators which are face-saving from their point of view and from our point of view. And why? Because while there can be a big sort of performance about enacting legislation to satisfy a key voting group for the party, in the end, the government doesn't want a major conflict with its people of faith. It certainly doesn't want a major conflict with its Islamic community. It cares much less about Christians, sure, but it doesn't really want a big conflict with the Christian community either, particularly a year out from an election, for example. And so you get this performative legislation, you get all sorts of speeches in Parliament about how we are introducing this new policy and everybody must comply. But at the end of the day, they don't want that sort of conflict. And a lot of the welfare work which we have in our society is done by Christian organizations. The government doesn't want those Christian organizations to withdraw their services. The Christian organization does not want to have to withdraw its services. And so there is plenty of room for compromise behind the scenes. What might you do? You might just tweak something on a website somewhere. You might release a statement which is carefully ambiguous. There are all sorts of ways in which you can negotiate a compromise behind the scenes with regulators, which, as long as it's not public, as long as it's not engaging in confrontation on the issues, will actually resolve the problem and people can live and let live. Now, there will come a point, undoubtedly, where we have to draw lines in the sand. There will be times when we have to say, here we stand. If there is a threat to our capacity to live quiet and godly lives. The example is given of conversion therapy legislation. In Victoria, the Equal Opportunity Human Rights Commission has something on its website which gives guidance to Christians, even praying on their own, about what they are allowed to pray for and what not. That sort of overreach is just nonsense. We're not going to be obeying that. So there are situations where we do have to draw lines in the sand. There may be very serious issues for big welfare organizations receiving a lot of government money where they have to say, we would rather close this ministry down than comply with those requirements. And I think one of the lines in the sand will be when a Christian organization can no longer be Christian. And at that point, you're just an agency for the government. That can be a purely secular organization. If you cannot be any different from a secular organization, that's where we have a line in the sand. But there's a very wise advice from Archbishop Fisher on this in a speech he gave a year or two ago, where he said, that's the nuclear option. Closing our Christian schools, closing our Catholic schools, that's the nuclear option. You can only do it once. And so we have to be very careful before we threaten that or do it. Well, there's so much more. But for that, you might have to buy the book. Thank you.